This is a story about systems. It's a story about how they entrap us, how they become bigger than the people within them, or even the people at the top of them. And it's a story about the idea of dreams, whether dreams can liberate us from those systems. Because, as the philosopher Schopenhauer pointed out, life and dreams are of one and the same book. Now, picture this idle fantasy. You get home from a meaningful 4 or 5 hour workday doing creative work you love. Repetitive chores are done for you autonomously. You spend an hour or two relaxing with the people you love, reading a book maybe, doing something you're passionate about. Then you log in to the community portals. This portal connects to several separate new blockchains. No one owns these blockchains. They're decentralized and are run democratically by the people that use them. That data is yours. One blockchain is similar to Facebook, as it used to be. Friends, families, events, photos. Another blockchain is a bit like X or Reddit, popular public posts. There's one for work. Another hooks up to different layers of governance, local, county, national, international maybe. There are many different variations depending on where you are, what you do. But all of the data is what's called interoperable. It's easy to switch between each. You own it and you plug your existing history and data and connections and subscriptions into each blockchain when you want. You have complete control. The traditional Facebooks and X's and Instagrams still exist, but they're a wild west of bots, trolls, AI, super slop. They're pretty much unusable, but people do still use them occasionally for some fun. But they're mostly seen as eating sweets are seen, addictive, unhealthy for children. Ultimately, you don't get much out of them. The big difference with community portals is that it's user verified. You have to authenticate that it's really you. One account per person. There had been a big debate about rights and digital ID and government surveillance, but it's only community portals that require verification. Everything else you do within is encrypted and decentralized and anonymized on the blockchain, and all sorts of Reddits, forums, shadow sites are still used without the need for ID by protest groups or activists who would rather stay anonymous. Some community portals are paid for by subscription, others by taxes, some still by advertising, others by other means. The portal, similar to Facebook, it still runs ads. That's good for small businesses and new products in particular. A lot of local stuff is advertised on there, but all of that ad revenue goes back into running the platform. The political portals work on different layers depending on the location or the department or the thing that's being done. You can log into your local town or council and see which issues are voted to the top this week. Meetings can be joined in person, in virtual reality, online. Anyone registered in the area can vote and contribute to the agenda and comment and point to studies and articles. In many countries and areas, all of the big industry is partially run by a combination of experts, a board, and democratically through the community portal. The point is to democratize decision making between expertise and anyone affected by that industry. All big industry data is plugged into the portal. Data is collected from machinery, vehicles, global mining, logistics chains, costs, profits, all sorts of issues, all updated sophisticatedly in real time and transparent to those who are verified. This is required of companies who have over a certain number of employees or a certain turnover. It doesn't affect small businesses or businesses still run by founders, as that's been found through studies to be mostly ineffective. Companies that meet the threshold are not unhappy with being democratized, as it's the most efficient way of doing business and connects the company to huge pools of data on the portals. Profits are slowly divested away from owners and management to a combination of workers and the community and experts who become community shareholders run through the platform. The ratio going to workers, locals and nationals is calculated fairly by who is most involved, who contributes the most and who is most effective. For example, the national energy grid is largely automated, connected to sophisticated smart meters and smart devices around the country. But workers get more votes and more of the profits, but everyone in the country gets a small dividend automatically in their account each quarter. Citizen revenue is enough to justify the shorter work hours. It's a small universal basic income. All land and natural resources are owned in principle by everyone. It's managed on the principles of Georgism, a single land value tax based on how valuable that land or the resources within the land or the environment are. This all discourages any speculation or hoarding of land and property and resources. Anything taken out of the ground is done so on the principle that it is, in part, everyone's. There are many different portal blockchain variations. Some are experimental, some fail. Some have huge amounts of data, others have different layers of voting rights or participation rules. The ones that fail are discarded quite quickly, the ones that succeed adopted by lots of other communities. There are portals for things like local tourism, tourism taxes, national park visitor fees, national heritage, all managed in a similar way. Local taxi cabs, takeaways, deliveries, Airbnbs, marketplaces, rentals all use the same principle. Taxis and Airbnb and a national marketplace like Amazon are owned by a combination of people who work on them and by the community that it affects. Profits are shared. One of the surprising consequences of all of this is how AI is used to parse the huge amounts of new data that was once siloed off but is now connected. Universities use it to run studies and experiments. They get paid for effective research from the portal. LLMs find solutions through strange combinations of things. For example, local marketplaces, community events and heritage are all connected. The biggest benefit has come from how hospitals and medical research are now connected to all of these portals. Health big data has become absolutely revolutionary. All of the billions per year that currently goes to big tech in California instead stays in local communities and countries for the most part and is paid out to citizens, those that work on it, those that are affected by it. Speculation on land, rent seeking and capital flight is largely kept to a minimum by these mechanisms. Taxes are much smaller because pre-distribution is focused on rather than redistribution. Politics is entirely transparent, democratic, and a combination of traditional and portal politics. Again, attached to local and national big data, funds are immediately directed where they're most needed democratically. Okay, there's probably a lot of holes that could be poked in this utopian vision. It's not a manifesto or a fully formed theory. I'm not even sure I believe in it. It's a set of ideas fired off from things I've read over the years that have lodged in my head. You might have some criticisms of parts. Some of it might strike you as utopian. Some of it might even seem completely mad to you. Or you may even have your own vision, your own variation on this theme. My real point is not really about the details here, but the disconnect. Why is it that we can fly to the moon, clone genes, theorize time travel, create virtual realities that are almost more real than real, but not get trains to run on time? More soberly, what is the relationship between this kind of vision, this kind of utopian vision, and reality? The place we live. Plumbing, remember, would seem like utopia to a medieval king. My shit gets flushed where? The French poet Anatole France reminded his 19th century contemporaries that, quote, without the utopians of other times, men would still live in caves, miserable and naked. It was utopians who traced the lines of the first city. Out of generous dreams come beneficial realities. Utopia is the principle of all progress and the essay into a better future. I'm interested here in that essay, in the distinction between the dreams that we conjure, write, think through in our heads, utopian fictions, ideal commonwealths, daydreams, images of minor improvements to the world and our lives, and the humdrum, the kind of physicality of daily reality. Like, take this example. What is this dream-like feed on our phones, conjured up in someone's head, transmitted through pixels through the air? Is it dream or is it reality? What are human rights to the ancient slave? Dream or a possible future reality? What are the flying cars to the engineer? There is something important in this question right now because of the hyper-real fantasies we all live on our screens. It's making it more and more lucid. What am I, for example, to you? Am I dream or reality? Are you sure that I'm real? Now, by nature, I am the kind of person that rolls their eyes at the kind of self-help, Oprahification world of manifestation. Sitting down with some beads and incense, cleansing the poisonous inner and outer demons, and visualizing my intentions, my goals, actively self-creating the future that you, want. I immediately reject this as the sort of woo-woo Katy Perry might preach from space, but in my less cynical moments I remember something. There is maybe nothing more powerful known to man than the collective human imagination, and that we've lost our capacity to manifest any kind of ideal political vision. Dreams of utopia have been dissipated into the drab assurances of new optimists like Steven Pinker that things will likely get slowly better. A humble downgrade, by the way, from Blair's things can only get better. And that's just the glass half full side. The other side of the ledger includes visions of AI, climate and nuclear apocalypse, along with timeless beliefs about the fallen, sinful condition of human nature. It's not things can only get better, nor maybe get better, but things can never get better. Things will inevitably get worse. Be thankful for what you have. Those are the visions floating around our collective imagination, our media space, our politics at the moment. The reality includes crises of economics, inequality, mental health, crises of meaning, media, trust, politics, crises of tech, critiques of broken systems are everywhere. But here's the irony. The existing system, despite all of this, seems as robust as ever. In the lacunae that has been left by the failures of utopian communism and utopian nationalism, there is a big question mark. What do we replace the future with? How do we get there? Is a better future even possible? I want to think through that idea that a system can be seen to be faulty but can still be more robust than ever. I don't think we understand this very well. For example, the majority deplore the excesses of capitalism, say, but of course participate in it and can't think out of it. We can be sick of social media, our phones, but continue using them. We even often hate our own freely chosen routines in ordinary life, but we continue to repeat them day in, day out nonetheless. We are all, very often, trapped in systems of our own making. Why is this? Well, the shortest definition of a system I could find is this: a set of connected things or devices that operate together. And a system becomes powerful precisely by those network effects of it operating together, hanging together. I recently have had problems with two tech companies, Vodafone and Lenovo. They're both huge systems made up of global networks of people, operations, logistics, truly embedded in the capitalist global world. But when you try and talk to someone at either of these big companies, when you try and raise a reasonable complaint, get your money back for something that's genuinely not working, you often run into this purposefully built brick wall. No one in these big systems is accountable. And so they're purposefully structured to resist someone trying to change what they're designed to do. No one in them can do anything. There's not a set of processes in place for certain things. It's all body and no head. These types of systems make up the world around us. I looked at the deep state through this lens in this video. I'm going to reference quite a lot of videos I've made in the past because this is the kind of coming together of a lot of my thinking over the last couple of years. So I'll link them above or below. But the idea of the deep state, taking it kind of neutrally, is that it's so ingrained with so many layers, so many specialists with very specific knowledge and powers made up of so many millions of people, even in one country often, that no one single person, not even a president or a united political party, can make much of a dent in it, can produce the change in the system that they want. Now, these systems have rules and processes and work in certain ways, and I'd like to think about them in these terms. I'd like to call them deep algorithms. If you want a picture of how the modern world operates, read Manuel Castells' The Network Society. Castells makes the case in it that the post-Fordist world economy is defined less by, say, industrial corporations or individual nations atomized, but by huge global networks. Since the emergence of a total network capitalist society in the 80s and the 90s, the complexity and flexibility of the globalized system is so connected that if one of the nodes, and this is how he refers to them, refuses to do something, malfunctions, rebels, or is broken, the network can simply bypass it. It can go elsewhere. Like a very efficient engine or organism, capitalism or the deep state or many other deep algorithms. Some have made the case that the brain, the neural networks in the brain work in this way, can self-heal by rerouting through different parts of the networked organism. Imagine a big flexible network, a global one of many different types. Any pressure group, any advocate for change, any ethical node trying to do something differently within the system, and so on, no longer has to be neutralized. No longer does it have to be arrested or executed, a totalitarian solution, but it can simply be ignored. You can reroute around it, which means that nothing is effective in active, actionable change by individuals trying to make an agentic change, trying to use their will to say this part needs to be changed. The system automatically goes around it. Let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about here. You raise minimum wages in one country, sweatshops move elsewhere. You criticise the intelligence services as Prime Minister or President. The intelligence services then withholds information crucial to your re-election and gives information surreptitiously through networks of other people that end up in competitors' hands. You ban slop from your social media platform because you know it's ethically bad. Your competitor allows it, outcompetes you, and you wither and die. Once you think in these terms, in this network society way, you see this everywhere. The most powerful example congressional aide Mike Lofgren uses in his attempt to take the deep state seriously is the power the intelligence services have over democratically elected officials. They choose, and they can do this on a mass scale, millions of times in lots of different small interactions, when to reveal, when to downplay, or when to exaggerate intelligence. It's all very subjective. And so they can always pull the lever, pull some of the strings in some way, having this surreptitious effect on the network. There's quote after quote from politicians about this kind of thing happening in the modern world, in our modern democratic systems. And the interesting thing for us today is that that deep algorithm has a lot of different ways of pulling and pushing different levers and strings. Lofgren writes that the subsurface part of the iceberg operates on its own compass heading, regardless of who is formally in power. If you're, say, a Jeremy Corbyn of the world, the banking, media, capitalist and political establishments, of course, all start acting in their millions, with their millions, to kill you by 1,000 tiny cuts. That's the deep algorithm in action. Clinton reportedly once said that, "You mean to tell me that the success of the economic programme and my re-election hinges on the Federal Reserve and a bunch of f***ing bond traders?" In response to David Cameron complaining that the civil service slows everything down, Jeremy Hayward, a top civil servant, told a committee that part of our role is to give advice as to whether something will work, whether something is contrary to the law. Occasionally, that will come across as trying to slow things down and stop things happening. That is part of our job. And that's such a lucid and boring example of how the deep algorithm works. It's very mundane, but it happens everywhere. There are so many different people with different interests and motivations pulling the tiny little variable levers that they have. And this all adds up into a huge, godlike deep algorithm. You apply tariffs, the stock market crashes and you have to retreat a bit. You cut taxes, the bond market crashes, you have to retreat a bit. You promise nationalisation of failing industry, Fleet Street kicks into gear. Every reaction in the network society, in the deep algorithm, has an equal and opposite reaction that bypasses, and tries to bypass at least, that initial attempt to change. And more than that, the opposite reaction negates the initial reaction. This is why it's a deep algorithm. It always has something to serve in response to a threat. It always has the resources, the means, the variables, the processes to keep doing what it does because it's so ingrained. And the response is based, and bear with me here, on kind of Newtonian or Euclidean chains of reaction. And I use this term carefully because I think it's the same kind of reasons we keep using social media platforms despite knowing that they're bad for us. We go in often with some resistance, some hope that they might serve something good for once, something interesting, not something sloppy or addictive or a waste of our time. But then the power of the attention economy to win through entertainment, through addictive clickbait, to provide short-term sugar is overpowering in the same way the bond market can overpower the ethicist. There are chains, Newtonian chains of compulsion in all of them. They react through bodies, lines, relationships, affects, pools of cash, resources, and power. The deep algorithm reaction pulls a greater weight, exerts more gravity than the liberating ethical action. We have a system in which the cogs keep clunkily turning. The US government, for example, employs 3 million people. The UK, 1% of its population. The Chinese CCP, 4%. Each of those individuals makes decisions based on their own small networks of information. That's a vast number of people. How much do Congress, to take one example, know about those millions of people and what they do and how they process things in their everyday work lives? The deep algorithm, the Newtonian algorithm, the Euclidean algorithm, is a state of chronic global inertia, meaning it resists changes in its state of motion. Its cogs, again, keep clunkily turning. The Newtonian model suggests that resistance is not strong enough. So how do we increase the strength of the resistance? We're driven around by bits and bytes, margins on profit sheets, job markets, habits and desires, by deep algorithms all around us. What does freedom, what does utopia mean in this modern, deterministic, Newtonian world? We're hungry, we eat. We're tired, we scroll. It's an election, we vote with the party choices that are given to us. Life is often a continual Groundhog Day. How do we break free from these big systems? We need to think carefully about freedom first. We usually think about freedom in the free from sense, free from tyranny, say. But tyrannical compulsions are everywhere. Many philosophers have pointed to the contradictions between a deterministic universe and our conception of freedom. How can anyone be free if we're all made of atoms? Marbles and dominoes tumbling through history, tumbling through the universe. The psychologist B.F. Skinner put it best when he said, quote, "A small part of the universe is contained within the skin of each of us. There's no reason why it should have any special physical status because it lies within this boundary." But I think freedom can be made compatible with this deterministic, deep algorithm picture. And this is literally called compatibilism, by the way. And a long list of very wise philosophers, from Socrates to Spinoza to Harry Frankfurt, have pointed to ways how. Plus, I think modern science now also backs this up in some way. And I think understanding freedom in a more consistent way is key to thinking about political progress. Let's start at the beginning with Socrates. If you look up at the Parthenon in Athens, there's a relief that depicts a horse driven by impulse and its rider trying to control it. This relief dates back to almost exactly the same time Socrates was discussing the same analogy. In Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, Socrates likened the soul to a chariot being pulled by two horses, the rational and the wild. In the mouth of Plato, the rational soul moves upwards towards heaven, getting progressively more logical, progressively better. But it gets pulled down by, say, the urge to do something you know you shouldn't do, like doom scrolling or eating too much cake. And this was called akrasia to the ancient Greeks, literally a lack of willpower. I think we all have this feeling of being pulled in different directions by competing drives and desires and things in the world, relationships and jobs and places we want to go. We are a torn species, and much of the time we feel pushed or pulled around as if controlled by something outside of us. In his Confessions, for example, Augustine wrote long ago and very beautifully that the madness of lust took complete control of me and I surrendered wholly to it. I think that's a great depiction of what happens, what that feels like when this is going on. But, and this is a huge but, in another of Plato's dialogues, Protagoras, Socrates points out that the person is not really divided at all. We are whole. We are one person, ultimately. We make singular decisions. When we think of the world in this algorithmic way, where all of these compulsions, clickbait, political slogans, economic choices are served to us to choose from, this makes complete sense. What's really going on is this. The option that's more compelling to our singular person, more affective, to use a term I'll expand upon a little bit in a minute, has more weight. Language used in AI and large language models, by the way, at any moment, that more forceful option, to me, is the path taken. And Socrates' trick was to make the better path more compelling by continually diminishing the things we want to stop doing and adding better knowledge to the things we want to start doing. Socrates was basically saying there's not two horses within us. This is ludicrous. One that wants to eat cake and one that wants to be healthy and live a long life. We are one person, so there's got to be something else going on. And he was basically saying that the person that eats the cake in the moment has decided that that's the better thing to do in the moment because it has more affective force for them. They have decided that they're very tired or very depressed, or they have certain genetic reasons for desiring the cake more. You know, we might be celebrating, might be having a birthday. There's lots of things that add up so that the ledger on this side is more powerful than the ledger on that side. And for the people that don't eat the cake, it's the other way around. Now, Socrates puts it like this. No one who either knows or believes that there is another possible course of action better than the one he is following will ever continue on his present course. He continues, no man voluntarily pursues evil, or that which he thinks to be evil. To prefer evil to good is not in human nature, and when a man is compelled to choose one of two evils, no one will choose the greater when he may have the less. I think there's so much insight in these paragraphs. Socrates says, poor judgment, making the wrong choice in the moment, is just a lack of knowledge. That's all. The key to making better choices is tipping those scales in favour of the choice we want to make. And I think this can be difficult to wrap our heads around at first. So let's expand on it with one of history's greatest, wisest modern philosophers, Baruch Spinoza. Now, Spinoza, made a video on him, I'll leave it below, is the philosopher of modern science, in that he saw that the entire universe was made up of cause and effect, that we are bodies, lines and planes, in his words, knocked around, that we are all atoms, molecules, that we all exist in the universe, we're all objects in the universe. And as a scientist of looking through glass, what he literally did for his job, by the way, Spinoza is the greatest mind we can draw on to think about the power of algorithms. Now, Spinoza started from this point that we're being knocked around all the time, that all these things have effects on us, that we are bundles of compulsions and desires. So when it came to freedom, the idea of freedom, Spinoza asked what reason can do against these affects. Now, there's an entire subdiscipline around this, by the way, called affect theory. Just think of an affect as an effect, something affecting something else. I have a video on that as well, I'll leave that below. In his Ethics, Spinoza said this: the power of an effect has its limits set by the power of its cause. Spinoza is basically reformulating what Socrates said in more modern terms here. He says, when something affects us, and remember, a thought, a desire is an affect too, it is a compulsion, it pushes and pulls us around. He says we have a corresponding evaluation in our heads of whether we think that affect as being good or bad. We think, okay, sugar tastes good, so that's 3 points to sugar. Doom scrolling feels good in the moment, it might distract me from being tired or bored or working, so that's 2 points to doom scrolling in the moment. But then we know from science and how we feel afterwards, say, that sugar affects our bodies negatively. So we might go, okay, that's -4 points to sugar. And so we don't want sugar anymore in that moment. It's gone below the threshold, the 0 point. We might say doom scrolling sometimes shows me something interesting. So that's 1 point added to the ledger. But it's mostly useless. We know this afterwards. So we'll give it -5. And that's below the threshold. So we stop wanting to do it as much. We do, very loosely, what Jeremy Bentham, a utilitarian philosopher, called a kind of hedonic calculus. We calculate the effects, the happiness it builds in us. And I don't subscribe to that entirely, but it's a good tool for thinking here. Because the point Spinoza made was that for this to actually be effective, for us to do this calculation, to write our ledgers effectively, we have to know the truth. We have to be knowledgeable. We have to understand things. That's what Socrates was saying too. We have to have the correct ideas about things. Otherwise, we're just being passively affected by everything around us. Spinoza writes that, quote, "The more an affect is known to us, the more control we have over it. Rather than being passive," he says, "we need adequate ideas." Here's a great passage from his Ethics, one of the greatest books of philosophy ever written. He said, "We should take special care to know each effect clearly and distinctly, as far as possible, so that the effect will lead the mind to have clear and distinct thoughts, ones with which it is fully satisfied, and so that the effect can be detached from the thought of an external cause and joined to true thoughts. The result will not only be that love, hate, etc. are destroyed, but also that the appetites or desires that usually arise from such an affect are stopped from being excessive." This is such a deep quote with so much going on, and I'd urge you to read through that book or think through that quote. But this is just essentially what Socrates was saying, that, if you are dropped as an alien into a human body for the first time and you taste sugar, you're gonna be affected by the compulsion to keep eating that. The power of that effect has a lot of power over you. It's only when you build rational knowledge about that thing scientifically that knowledge can have more power than the effects that all these things around us are having on us. Socrates and Spinoza are saying just better knowledge, better judgments, more reason. And what's great about this framework is A, of course, that it's true, but B, because of that, you can apply it to political algorithms too. You go into government, or you start a pressure group, or you campaign, and you're surrounded by all of these affects, these people promising things, telling you want their information, their reward, that there's this quid pro quo between you. The message is drowned out, but there are a million bureaucratic processes. You're against so much money, so many other secret negotiations, the press, the media. You've got all these different, again, effects having an effect on you. Spinoza put it like this: an effect is greater in proportion to how many causes collaborate in producing it. So the deep algorithm produces these huge and powerful affects that it's very difficult to build an alternative affect to overcome. Finally, the American 20th century philosopher, to bring it back to something a bit more modern, Harry Frankfurt, put it like this. He had similar ideas, but he said, we have first order desires, these kind of immediate desires. I want to eat the cake. But then we also have second order desires. I don't want to eat the cake. And the key is to match those second order desires to how you actually act in the moment. And Spinoza would say that it's that second order desire which should align with what's rational, what you think from all the combined information you have, all the logical information that's available to you in the world, i.e., this compulsion, this desire I have, it's good, it's virtuous, it's healthy, it's beneficial to me and others, I'm content with it. You can build up a picture. There's a whole constellation of ideas and appraisals and, again, what Spinoza called adequate ideas. You have to be honest with yourself. You have to have a unbiased and objective reading of the science and all of the rest of it. Now, I'm not saying that it's always wrong to eat the cake in this example, or it's always wrong to doom scroll. The point is, it's right if it aligns with what you reasonably, logically, rationally, all things considered, with reflection, want to do in that moment and with the future in mind. Frankfurt had a wonderful way of phrasing it, and I think this sums up all of this. That the right thing to do is when you want what you want to want. Now, I know what you might be thinking. He's gone completely off piece. What's this got to do with anything at the beginning? But please bear with me. I genuinely think all of this is very important, and it will come together and hang together in a minute. Here's a big question though. How do you want what you want to want? This is where I think there are huge consequences for deep algorithms and freedom everywhere. I think the best new ideas come from a collision between subjects that have new commonalities, that hang together in those adequate ideas, as Spinoza put it. I've made videos, for example, on social media, on addiction, free will, on big capital, on the attention economy. And in my mind, these all hang together as a way of trying to understand our present moment. And I'm trying to get better and better at articulating that. How all of these things create a new cauldron of potential. Take this book on anxiety by psychiatrist and neuroscientist Judson Brewer. It's really about how habits are changed. Well, I think when thinking about deep algorithms and the commonalities between, say, social media and politics and economics, habits are crucial, and they're becoming even more fundamental to how we think through modern problems. Brewer argues in almost exactly the same way Socrates, Spinoza and Frankfurt did. He says, for example, that we only ever really do what we think is the right thing to do in the moment. We might think something was a better thing to do in retrospect after, but in the moment we only ever do what we think the right thing to do is. And this is so misunderstood, I think, when it comes to things like addiction and making the wrong and right decisions, and this model of willpower being this tussle between two sides of us. No, we're singular. We only do what we think the right thing to do is. And throughout this book on anxiety, there's a repetition of a structure that he talks about. Trigger, behaviour, reward. This is a kind of habit structure. And he talks about this over and over. This is something we so often forget, that even anxiety, stress, crying, pain, shouting, eating poorly, smoking, drinking, we do it because of some kind of reward that in the moment our brain thinks is the best reward available. And I think you can take this very foundational, fundamental psychology and apply it to big tech, which is, such a large portion of our economy and culture and how the world works, and then by extension politics and political economy too, that we can take this reward structure of habit and how we misthink it and see commonalities in why deep algorithmic systems resist our change, because they're made up of algorithmic habits that have certain rewards programmed in. Brewer points out that the prefrontal cortex, the rational decision-making part of the brain, is literally wired to pursue what it thinks is the most rewarding pathway at any given moment. If it thinks it's right, it does it. So the key to changing anything is to really convince that prefrontal cortex that it's not right, to give it what Brewer calls a bigger, better offer. He says, forget willpower. It has a limited value in changing habits in the world. He says, the only sustainable way to change a habit is to update its reward value. That's why it's called reward-based learning. And again, if we extend this to politics, we can think about reward-based change. He continues, if you really pay careful and close attention without making any assumptions or relying on past experience to guide you, and you see that a behaviour is not rewarding right now, I promise you that you will start to get less excited about doing it again. And finally, he writes, the reward-based learning theory has been demonstrated to be the strongest learning mechanism known in science. In other words, what Socrates, what Spinoza said, all those hundreds and thousands of years ago has been vindicated by modern science. And I think this has huge political ramifications that we're not thinking through clearly. We can say, for example, that if you want to not doom scroll, you have to rewire your brain to find a more attractive alternative in that moment. Fine. But take how our political systems operate. Liberal capitalism was superior to feudalism because it had greater affective power. It was built on sugar, freedom of choice, colourful silks, you name it. It was, of course, going to win the affective battle. And social media algorithms are functioning in a very, very similar way. Of course, they're going to have more affective power compared to what? Your boring, monotonous, average life. Again, of course, it's going to win. This dream reality it presents, of course, it's going to have such a powerful, affective, compulsive draw on your brain. So the real difficulty with dreams beyond the algorithm is that when you gamble on a new system, you cannot prove that it's going to be better or worse until it's tried. You're betting on something imagined, something conjured, something dreamed up. And I think this leads to and elucidates some of the limitations in how someone like Marx saw progress. He in many ways thought like Spinoza and Socrates and Frankfurt. He thought that there was an affective power in capitalism that would diminish as inequality grew and wages shrunk and prices increased and firms centralised and so on. He thought that when that happened, the affective power of all the benefits of capitalism would diminish to the point where the power of the proletariat would have to overcome it. But what he didn't count on, I think, is how the bourgeoisie could raise the affective power just enough to placate workers. A few reforms here, a few minimum wage increases there, a few more days off that week. How do you know if any alternative to that system that we have is going to be better or is going to be a disaster? How do you know that you're not going to get a Stalin or a Kim Jong-un? How do you risk the unintended consequences? This is why a diet is so unappealing, because it's this imagined future that in your head is entirely awful compared to the present that you're living in, where you're eating all the carbs and chocolates you want. How do you know that that fantasy is going to have more of a logical consistency and more of an effective draw than what you currently have? Of course, you could, I'm pointing to kind of utopian visions very loosely here, but you could make the same arguments about slavery and capitalism too, of course. You could say slavery is the best system, feudalism is God's will, unregulated capitalism is self-balancing and the best we have. And all of these systems, all of those points made throughout history were true at a certain time. They were the best systems until a bigger, better system, a bigger, better offer came along and had more affective power. So how do you create the bigger, better offer? In his book on the importance of utopia and utopian thinking, Ernst Bloch includes forms of wishful thinking, daydreaming, sexual fantasies and so on in that type of utopian thinking. That they are all forms of what he describes as anticipatory consciousness. In other words, hope. And hope is foundational to how we live. We're all idealists in some sense, whose psychology revolves in some way around the not yet, as Bloch put it. Call it utopia, ideology, call it fantasy, call it a plan. I think we pay too little attention to the relationship between the images of the future in our heads and the pragmatic steps we take to try and get there. Utopia is an idealism, and so many emancipatory or left-leaning thinkers write it off. And utopia is a mythology. It's something conjured up here. Even the most grounded of scientists, though, have to be, in some ways, utopian. They have to think in terms of ideas conjured up, the not yet. Yet our thinking in the 20th and 21st centuries is still grounded, maybe hampered, by a kind of vulgar materialism. We think in terms of data, polls, statistics, measurements, GDP, scientific instruments, engineering, the politics of what is in front of us empirically, the politics of the possible. All the while we spend our idle hours, and some less idle ones, being driven around by those pixels on a screen. We think we're materialists, but we live in a hyper-real dream world. When I read the great German idealists, Kant, Schopenhauer, Hegel and so on, they describe a psychology that to me holds up to this day, that all we really are the pictures in our heads, that we all live by our own private algorithms, that are images, that conjure up images, that turn our heads, our hands, our eyes, our thoughts this way and that, but that crucially we all have the logical, rational framework to organise those images, sounds, feelings, phantasms, fantasies and ideas in our heads in a way that is, to the best of our abilities, rational and hopefully progressively more true. That utopias, whether a daydream or a political system, always have a kernel of rationality within them that can grow. Now, you might be thinking that I sound crazy, that just because I can imagine it doesn't make it rational or real. But I would argue that the only gap is the yawning one between the now and the not yet. That what makes something irrational is often only that it's posited way too many steps ahead, out of the realm of the immediately possible. Has many conditions attached to it, so many fantasies and possibilities. It is in the not yet here space. But consider that even the unicorn, the Pegasus, immortality, the technology that you can only today dream of, teleportation, might be rational one day. Consider that there's nothing you can rule out. Is there anything that you can think of now that, with the strange new knowledge and technology we have about the quantum world, say, about genetics, about how technology has progressed, can be ruled out absolutely, can be ruled out as absolutely impossible? I'd argue that this proves the point that there is a logical connection between the utopian, fantastical images that we conjure in our heads and empirical reality. And that we need to better understand the relationship then between the now and the not yet. Because, as Glenn Negley writes in his book The Quest for Utopia, what could be of more significance in the history of civilization than that man, since he first began to think and write, has continued ever to dream of a better world, to speculate as to its possible nature, and to communicate his longings to other men in the hope that the ideal might, at least in part, become reality. Utopian thinking is universal. It has taken a bewildering number of forms across history and across the globe. The most obvious, utopian science fiction, and the most critical, dystopian or Orwellian visions. They're present in Gardens of Eden, Babylon, Heaven, in Atlantis, in Plato's Republic, led by a wise philosopher king. Utopias have been drawn out carefully, warts and all, in great fiction like Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, a wonderful book, one of my favourites. We forget that the Nazis were utopians too, and while Engels and Marx claim not to be, there was a vision of the world to be radically transformed. My point is, utopias and utopian thinking come in many more forms and are much more common than we often assume. And all of these, before we get to movies and books and fairy tales and declarations of human rights conjured out of someone's head by someone's pen, and innumerable theories of ideal commonwealths across history. And I think we've come to a slight historical impasse because despite their universality, despite how common and often very reasonable they have appeared across history, the horrors of the 20th century have not only destroyed our faith in utopia, but made us entirely allergic to them. Conservatives are ideologically opposed, of course, but since Marx and Engels dismissed previous socialist programs as utopian rather than scientific, as not unfolding by observable scientific laws, the left has been equally suspicious, with liberals in the middle tinkering with a few levers here and there, and scientists working on small, isolated improvements in engineering or medicine. What are we left with in utopian terms? Utopia has been banished. Of course, we fear utopian rhetoric and systems and plans for very good reason. It's led to death camps, to previously unimaginable wars, and it's led to oppression on a scale never before seen in history. And as far back as 1879, Maurice Kaufmann was writing that the cause of the general failure of utopian systems as a whole and the partial acceptation of some truths they contain is to be found in that wholesome tendency of average men to be guided by practical rather than ideal considerations, to prefer tentative measures to thoroughgoing schemes of social improvement. In other words, this fear and rejection of utopia preceded the horrors of the 20th century by quite a margin. But again, the increased fear, the new fear, has left a huge gap, a place we're told we shouldn't even imagine. And it's yet to be proven that banishing utopia from the realm of reason is going to avoid an equal and opposite dystopia. In other words, dystopia does not just emerge from utopian plans gone wrong. It emerges from normal, pragmatic, so-called liberal politics too. Pragmatic reason got us the nuclear bomb after all. And I think we need to think more carefully about returning to some kind of revision of utopian thinking, because Oscar Wilde put it best. He said, "A map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing, and when humanity lands there, it looks out and seeing a better country, sets sail. Progress is the realisation of utopias." For every failed utopia, there are great changes in history that seemed utopian to those who lived before them, that could only imagine them. Changes in history that were political, economic, technological, in medicine, in science, that looked like an unimaginable fantasy to someone living in the past. The metaphor of a map is a good one, but here's the big question. Can you have progress, any real progress, without a map that includes some kind of ideal utopian vision? I think there are a few ways of answering this. One is that without a map you can keep plodding along, making small reforms and making small steps of progress in the sciences, say, or you can look down the dystopian route. You can have a grand engineered utopian map, but the map is wrong, hasn't been designed right. It's been designed by humans that were flawed and made misconceived assumptions about others. And so that actually leads you further away from the truth, down the wrong path in the map, and maybe towards catastrophe. But I think the third way of thinking about it is more intriguing. that you are both making small steps of progress, but the progress is limited because the map is wrong. The map in your head is both causing you to make these minor improvements, but is missing that there's a much better way over here. How do you redraw a map that seems to us to be so accurate, but you don't have the map of the alternative world to compare it to? This is an important question for science and politics and relationships, for our own psychology, our own habits, that sometimes you can have a map that seems so convincing that you hesitate to redraw it. You're scared of the alternative. The distinction between the Newtonian and the quantum world is again a good example here. The maps that we have seem to work in places, but something doesn't quite fit. When you bring them together, there's contradictions, something's wrong. And I think the same could be applied to, say, Smith's description of supply and demand and the neoclassical economic framework that we mainly still rely on today. It seems to work most of the time, but then falls apart at the macro scale so often that it can lead to crashes and depressions and depressed wages and much poverty and many deaths. But we don't have a very good alternative map. Some of the maps we have tried have maybe worked temporarily, but then failed. And I think a good way of thinking about this is Thomas Kuhn's concepts of normal and revolutionary science in his influential book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The kind of liberal map without utopia is like how Kuhn describes normal science. It works in this framework and it plods along and it fills certain gaps here and there in research, and it expands upon the ideas that came before, the kind of assumptions and foundations of it, all in a predictable, rational line. It is, Kuhn says, cumulative, it builds up. And in fact, what's interesting is Kuhn did also use the word map. He writes, quote, "The paradigm provides a map whose details are elucidated by mature scientific research, and since nature is too complex and varied to be explored at random, that map is as essential as observation and experiment to science's continuing development. Through the theories they embody, paradigms prove to be constitutive of the research activity." We all have to have this kind of research map defined by a kind of maybe limited vision of utopia, of that goal we're trying to achieve. But sometimes, and this is Kuhn's big point, there are anomalies. The map doesn't quite work, problems don't quite fit into the paradigm, and those aren't solvable with the tools, the maps, the frameworks that we have within that paradigm. Kuhn writes that when for these reasons, or others like them, an anomaly comes to seem more than just another puzzle of normal science, the transition to crisis and to extraordinary science has begun. The anomaly itself now comes to be more generally recognised as such by the profession. More and more attention is devoted to it by more and more of the field's most eminent men. Now, we all have anomalies in our lives, contradictions in how we think, in our habits, in our political systems, in our technological ones, in how we interface with all of these things, our habits of everyday life, with the way we use our technology, how we interface with our deep algorithms. But what do anomalies say to us? Are they the root of an alternative dream, an alternative fantasy of overcoming the contradiction, the problem, a world where the problem, the desire, is solved, a utopian world? Sometimes, Kuhn points out, it's the passionate search through anomalies that leads to new paradigms being created. The Copernican revolution, the discovery of bacteria or oxygen, of genetics, of how gravity operates. Importantly, the move between old, redundant, failed paradigms and new ones is based on the creation or the discovery of a new logic, a new, more consistent logic, a logic that was once a dream that everyone now adopts as reality. Take how the French revolutionaries operated. This was one of the greatest breaks in history. An old, ancient regime of hierarchy, Catholicism, order, feudalism, and then a radical break, on the other side of which we have the rights of all men, then women, the freeing of slaves, the tearing down of feudal dues and privileges, a world turned upside down. In fact, what the philosophers of the Enlightenment discussed in the century leading up to that revolution looks a lot like a utopia, and then it was forced into reality. The big question is, how did the logic of that change unfold? The most common frame to approach this is to ask whether futures are freely created, imagined, and then inaugurated, or in some way determined as a historical progress. If you take 1789, that radical French Revolution year, the storming of the Bastille, that 0 point, the old Marxist interpretation of it says that that event was largely determined by economic factors and the rise of the bourgeoisie, that historical forces built up to an extent which, like a motor suddenly whirring, propelled France into the future, that there was a certain logic to it. From a different angle, but a similar one, Whig historians agreed. There was a logic of process, of increasing freedom. But I think today most historians refute both of these views. In the 80s, innovative new cultural historians like Lynn Hunt, a wonderful historian of the French Revolution and human rights, argued that events like the Revolution were created culturally first, through stories and symbols and costumes and language and theatre and poetry and songs, through a culture, before the revolution even took off. That these new cultures turned the world upside down in ways that seemed irrational to others outside of it, but that were actually creating a new logic, one that functioned better than the old one, and so became more affective, became more powerful. You know, the idea that everyone had equal rights seemed absolutely logically absurd to the logic that maintained the ancient regime. There was a whole cultural, historical, economic and philosophical logic that backed up hierarchy. A logic that was very, very convincing. It was based on, say, Aristotle, that everything has a place, that if you drop a stone, it falls to the floor because that's where it belongs, and that a peasant's the same, that a king's at the top because that's where God willed him to be, he was born into it, of course that's where he should be, that a peasant, pauper, was poor and subservient because of the same reason, because that's where God willed him, because he was inferior. How do you counter this very convincing logical system? How do you convince people that actually there's something within everyone that's kind of equal, that utopia is possible? You create a new logic, a new cultural logical paradigm that hangs together logically, that has more affective force than the existing one. You point to, say, Newton overturning the Aristotelian view of the universe. You point to John Locke's arguments about rights. You point to proto-anthropologists describing all the different cultural and political possibilities that have been discovered recently over the globe and across history. You describe the folly of kings and the virtues of freedom of expression. You work out a logic of freedom of trade and exchange on markets to replace regulations and feudal dues, a la Adam Smith, and the king's selling of offices. You point to the hidden hand of the market to create supply and demand. All of this new stuff hangs together in a new cultural logical system that becomes more convincing than that old divine right of kings, everything in its place one. You create, you describe, you uncover a new reasonable logic. That historian, Lynn Hunt, talked about her influential book on the French Revolution like this, quote, My aim was not to reduce revolutionary discourse to one stable system of meaning, the reflection of community, for example, but rather to show how political language could be used rhetorically to build a sense of community and at the same time to establish new fields of social, political and cultural struggle. That is, make possible unity and difference at the same time. Unity and difference. How all of these cultural logics hung together in unity, in opposition to existing logics, different from them. These questions are similar across many great historical breaks. Take the Christian Revolution, that the first will be last and the last will be first, that the slave is of more or equal worth than the emperor, in opposition to the logic of the Roman regime of power and domination. That is an alien but radical revolutionary logic in a Roman world. This is how utopias are constructed, logically and carefully and convincingly. And in many ways, I think this was the failure of Marxism, that it described a logic of capitalism that held very true, the existing order, but refused to try and work out a logic of what would come next. The lesson in all of this is, once you create a system with a genuine logic, a unity that hangs together and makes sense, that is better, it begins, like gravity, to have a force of its own, to have a culture built around it, to draw people in. I have a book back here, for example, Political Actors, Representative Bodies and Theatricality in the Age of the French Revolution by Paul Friedland. I've read it at university writing a dissertation about the French Revolution, rights and theatre, and it describes how, again, before that French Revolution even happened, there was a change in French theatre that was devised out of, that was written with the logic in mind of the Enlightenment that had happened in a century or two before. That the old logic had Louis XIV as the Sun King, the divine right logic, the thing which everything else revolves around, hierarchical at the top. And that there were symbols of this all over French culture. There were stories derived from it in plays, in songs, in poetry, whatever. But that across the Enlightenment period, new plays displaced those older symbols. They tore them down in some way. They created new forms of popular individualist entertainment, bourgeois entertainment. And the masses came. It was more affective, it was more entertainment. People loved it more. Take that image and imagine a new type of social media. One that is both more entertaining, more effective, but also re-represents how we think of ourselves politically, economically, technologically. What this taught me is that if you're creating an alternative, it cannot be dry. That if you describe the world in a new way that makes logical sense, then with that gravity, it will attract others. It will attract entertainers and poets and writers and filmographers and better ways of doing things, and it will attract people who entertain through wit. It will attract comedians, and that you need all of that stuff around it for it to have that alternative cultural force in comparison to the old system. The whole universe of symbols will start being creative around it and have a powerful draw, that it's symbols against symbols all the way down. In 1789, the French revolutionary Third Estate were locked out of their usual meeting place and instead gathered at the tennis court in Versailles in opposition to the king and the royalists, where they made an oath not to leave until a constitution was established, a scene immortalised by Jacques-Louis David in this painting. They continued, over the next week, to meet where they could, deliberating and calling themselves the National Assembly, an alternative symbolised by that oath in the tennis court, in that physicalised representation of an alternative logical space derived from Enlightenment ideas. The Third Estate drew, as many of them were lawyers, on a century and more of carefully thought out modern and scientific ideas that all hung together, along with all of the hedonistic pleasures that freedom of trade and the import of sugar and spice and colourful silks brought them. They were irresistible. They had a powerful Spinozian affect, a literal taste of freedom. Many of these men, like their American counterparts, were scientists, traders, business owners, lawyers, and philosophers. They brought it all together in a cultural, symbolic language. They built upon a heritage of Enlightenment logic and created an alternative space, an alternative ideology in that tennis court, a space that then expanded across the globe. In 2014, in Taiwan, hackers discontented with poorly performing government websites scraped them and created their own better forked versions. These new versions became so popular that ministers then adopted and merged them as official. V-Taiwan, as it's called, has some experimental features. It's for public deliberation about policy and organises responses in clusters that show different groupings of consensus. It avoids the so-called flame wars you get on platforms like X by not being able to reply to particular people and so set off these singular arguments that grow into rage, but instead highlight only bubbles of consensus and division between groups. The point is to find bridges between opposing views rather than focusing on unbridgeable divisions. There is a strong political culture surrounding V-Taiwan. 80% of the issues discussed on it led to legislation. Half the population has used it. Uber has been regulated through it. Financial technology rules have been worked out with it, and even school times discussed. It has issues, of course, including being skewed towards the more digitally literate, but it's innovative. If X is described as the public square, as it often is, compare it to V-Taiwan, which is designed for deliberation, an important part, of course, of democracy, deliberation. Would anyone call X a platform for deliberation? Unlikely. Taiwan is often ranked as one of the most transparent democracies in the world. There are countless experiments in decentralised social media platforms, and while none of them have taken off, and all of them are flawed in some ways, they seem to be the closest thing to the kind of alternative logic I've been discussing. Open standards, owned by no one, much like how the web operates, interoperability, biometric ownership, open source, democratised. In this book, Plurality, Glenn Will and Audrey Tank point to David Kidd and Ariana Zetlin's theory of reforming qualifications as an example of how stuck we are. They have argued that instead of single traditional qualifications that you reach at the end of school, we should have the gradual achieving of different badges across education that add up into bigger badges that act as qualifications that you can build upon. And Wheel and Tang argue this would work well as education becomes more decentralised through technology. Badges could be achieved across different institutions, logged on blockchains, added to other achievements in education and work, a CV of hobbies and all sorts of things, a kind of all-in-one LinkedIn alternative that's yours, that you have ownership over. Or take Sprightly, a vision of self-governing groups online that can connect with one another in different ways. Now, there are countless ideas and trials and failed experiments out there like this, and no real spectacular alternatives have taken off or worked yet. And I think the philosophy laid out here accounts for part of the reason why. deep algorithms are ingrained as habits in our social media, our feeds, our political systems, even our own personal habits and relationships. Creating new habits, as that science we looked at now shows, is about building a logic of alternative, better habits, ones that have the affective power to move people into a paradigm shift. In fact, when Lewis Mumford wrote the story of Utopia back in 1922, he pointed to the relationship between habits and utopia. He wrote, "What is entailed is a new set of habits, a fresh scale of values, a different set of relationships and institutions, and possibly an alteration of the physical and mental characteristics of people." When we stare at our algorithms, we are deeply compelled through ingrained sets of habits, values, and needs into certain routines that become automatous and humdrum. What motivates the kind of dreams served up by algorithms on social media? Are they utopian dreams? Or are they pictures, fantasies, images, motivated by fatigue, despondency, unfulfilled desires, dreams of wealth, fame, celebrity, distraction? I know they're entertainment, and I'm not so naive to think alternatives like Taiwan can have an effective force as powerful as entertainment does. But nonetheless, politics is already deeply ingrained in the logic of entertainment, in the power of these affective, deep algorithms. I mean, have you seen the most influential political figures recently? Does this set of ideas about affect not explain this? There is a strange but very important relationship here between the affective force of politics and the affective force of entertainment, the force of real improvements and the force of something that captivates, that we are drawn to, for the poetry maybe, in the kind of rhetoric of Obama sense, or the comedy maybe, in the Trump sense. I think wit and humour are of course powerful affective political tools, as poetry or music or film are, if they serve a bigger logic. And that something bigger has to be bringing it all together into a coherent alternative vision that hangs logically together, that moves our habits into a new set of habits, without which it's the status quo, or worse, the pageantry of authoritarianism that historically wins out, that has the more effective habitual pull. I point to blockchains and democratizing through technology at the beginning because there are, I think, a lot of consistencies between the two and the history of emancipatory, anarchist, democratic self-governing and socialist thought. But those types of technologies, because of the kind of broism of it, have been abandoned to libertarians, to capitalism, by most leftists, which I think is strange. We need utopians now who are like the Founding Fathers, Enlightenment thinkers who try and combine the best of everything, who thought about technology and science and medicine and new libraries and, encyclopedias and the great possibilities of secularism at the same time as their political philosophies, their constitutional legal thought. I don't know the answers, but our role, I think, is only to find those consistencies, those symmetries, those ideas that are coherent, while innovating with what is new in history, to bring it all together, to provide the idea of a utopian, logical, realistic alternative that we might one day reach. To draw that all out and to think all that through, I think that's all we can do. History will do the rest. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and thank you to all of these Patreons for making this possible. YouTube's really hard at the moment, and a lot of you don't even see the videos I make. The algorithm is hyper competitive, so it makes Patreon more crucial than ever. If you can support these videos and you want them ad free and early, and to see the history course and to get access to scripts and all the rest, it's hugely appreciated. If not, please do click that bell. That bell is really important because so few of you see every video from what I've told until sometimes months after their release. And the most important thing you can really do to help with the algorithm is just to watch them. There's a reason I made this a bit simpler, straight to camera. It's because we are working on a big history of fascism video, one that I've been working on since at least the beginning of the year, but reading on it for it really much longer, and it's kind of a companion piece or prequel to how the Holocaust happened, which is still one of my most popular videos. So we've been working very hard on getting that ready for you, and I'm kind of excited about it. I think it's good, and it's a real different take on fascism, really thinking through it, not from the normal good versus evil lens, but how did this really develop, how do people really justify this, and how maybe did it seem very normal to people. I think that's the most crucial thing to get across. So if you are looking forward to that, hit that bell, hit subscribe, follow along on Patreon. You can do so for free on Patreon. You don't even have to subscribe, and you'll get some updates. And the more people that do that, the more I will add updates to the free tier on Patreon. It would be a good place to just keep in touch with you. But yeah, thank you so much. Let me know what you think of this video in the comments, and I will see you next time.